So again, Boker Tov, Shavuot, Chodesh Tov. It's wonderful to be back here and to meet you all again. And hopefully this time we'd have a long time of learning and without any interruptions. We speak today about a very interesting figure of Yitzchak Hutner. And Rav Yitzchak Hutner, who was born in 1906 in Warsaw, in Poland, one of his interesting ideas out of many is the emphasis he put on writing. When you write a biography of a Gadol, of a Rav, then do not do what is called hagiography, meaning do not write only nice, good, clean stories. And because it's so crucial to what we are doing here throughout all of this series of shiurim of our great rabbis, I thought it would be nice to quote from him. So that's, if you can please pass the pages, because of some mistake in my typing, then instead of having one page, one line for my notes, you would see it's on the top of your page source sheet, and because of that, one line from the source sheet went over to the next page. So, yeah, fine. Technology, fine. We are thankful for what we have. Okay, see? Okay. I will share it also in the Zoom. So that's a letter that he wrote to a student of his. And that's what he writes. Ra'a chola, source aleph. Ra'a chola אצלנו. So that's a disease, he says, that we have. שכאשר מתעסקים אנו בצדדי השלמות של גדולינו, when we are dealing with the perfectness sides of our גדולים, of our rabbis, איננו מטפלים בסיכום האחרון של מעלתם. So we look at them as they looked as final products. מספרים אנו על דרכי השלמות שלהם. We speak about their paths of perfectness. בשעה שאנו מדלגים על המאבק הפנימי שהתחולל בנפשם. But we skip on all of the internal conflicts that they went through in their own souls. So you look at, give in a second an example from the Chafetz Chaim. And you speak about the Chafetz Chaim when he was 90. But the Chafetz Chaim was not born 90. He was born and he was 9 years old and also 19 years old. And he passed throughout all of different internal struggles. And it is unfair that when we teach about our Gdolim, we begin from the end, and by that we deprive ourselves from the ability to see them for what they were, which is even greater because they did struggle and came out victorious, and also it deprives us from the ability to learn from them because we are in the midst of our struggling, and it is unfair to compare ourselves to the final products. הרושם של שיחתנו, so the impression from our way of speaking על הגדולים, about the greats, מתקבל כאילו יצאו מתחת יד היוצר בקומתם ובצביונם. So it seems like they were born already made and completed. התוצאה מזה, and the outcome is, כשנער בעל רוח, when you have a young man, a young boy, he was Rosh Yeshiva for youth, so you have a 16, 15, 17 years old guy, בעל רוח, and he has a spirit, בעל שאיפה, he has ambition, בעל תסיסה, but also he has תסיסה, he's steaming. מוצא בעצמו מכשולים. Now he confronts different obstacles, נפילות, and maybe falls, ירידות, he declines, הרי הוא דומה בעיניו כבלתי שתול בית השם. So he looks at himself and he says, oh, I'm so different than these rabbis. I can never even dream about being somewhere near them. אבל דע לך חביבי. So he writes in this letter to the young man, he says, you should know, my dear, ששורש נשמתך הוא לא השלווה של היצר טוב, אלא דווקא מלחמתו של היצר טוב. You should know that the root of your soul, and it means not only the one that he writes to, but that of men, usually of men, regular men, the root of our soul, the root of our growth, is not in the peacefulness of the good inclination, but in the war of the good inclination, in the struggle. באנגלית אומרים, and he writes the letter in Hebrew, but I guess that he wants to enrich himself with an English idiom. So he says, lose a battle and win the war. So sometimes you lose the battle, and sometimes you fall. But the question is not did you came victorious in a specific battle, but were you able to win the war in its entirety? בוודאי שהנך נכשל ועומד להיות נכשל. So that's a Rav writing to one of his students, says, I know that you had failed, and I am sure that you will fail in the future. Now, that's very strong to hear. And he says, אין בזה משום פתיחת פה לשטן. It's not opening our mouth, חס וחלילה, to the bad, right, to the other side, because it's just human nature. Human nature is that we will have falls. ובכמה מערכות תיפול שדוד. There would be a few combats that you'd come out with your hand on the downside. אבל אני מבטיח לך, but I promise you, שלאחר הפסד כל המערכות, after you'd lose so many battles, תצא מן המלחמה כשזר הניצחון על ראשך. But you can still come out of the war with the victorious head flowers on your head. החכם מכל אדם אמר, so שלמה המלך said, שבע יפול צדיק וקם. The righteous one can fall 7 times, but he still stands up. הטיפשים חושבים, so the stupid people think, כי כוונתו בדרך רבותא. שלמה המלך meant it as even the tzaddik, the righteous person would fall 7 times, מכל מקום הוא קם. Still, yet he would be able to stand up. That's not the right explanation. החכמים יודעים, the wise know, שהכוונה היא, שלמה המלך intention was, שמהות הקימה של הצדיק היא דרך 7 הנפילות שלו. So it's not that the tzaddik will fall 7 times and would still stand up. Why he would stand up? Because he fell. The falling, the failing is part of the path to greatness. And if we do not tell the real story about our great people, then we are losing the very thing that we try to educate for, which is the great for pathness, the path for greatness, excuse me. So that's such a striking observation from a man that is both, he's writing beautifully, but he's also a master of education, or maybe even better, a master of the soul. And that is, I think, maybe the most important thing that when we give, obviously, when I give 45 minutes shiur, an hour shiur about Rav Yitzchak Hutner, we cannot think that we would be able to encompass all the facets of the sides of his personality and of his teachings and of his thought. But if we are trying to capture one of the main themes that runs throughout all of his writings, I think that the understanding of the soul of the human being, and as we will see, becoming an individual, and him as an educator, helping others to become individuals. That was an idea that he not only believed in and developed, but he lived in its light. So let's now begin the story. As I said, Rav Hutner was born in 1906 in Warsaw, in Poland, and his family was a family that was combined from his father's side from a Lithuanian family and his mother's side from a Ger Hasidim family. That's why they were in Warsaw. Warsaw was a very strong Ger stronghold. So he is going there. As a child, it is unclear for us as a child where exactly did he land, but it seems that in Hasidic Cheders, that seems to be where he was learning, but also with Lithuanian teachers. And I think even that type of openness to different streams that fed very well into his inclination, as I said, to become his own person. He was not a man to be molded in one cookie cutter, right? And become a ger chassid or a Lithuanian. He knew, and from very young age, with his diary, from very young age, he wrote about how, on one hand, he wants to be close to his rabbis and to be mitbatel to them, right? To nullify himself in front of them and to accept from them. But on the other hand, he says, I am unwilling to be sealed by someone else than my own neshama. I have to have my own identity, which is, again, very, I think, interesting and not so usual. His daughter was, well, excuse me, I didn't write the name down, and that's unfair. I cannot remember it right now. Hopefully it would come to me. I think David's, her family was David's. I would, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, I would be reminded in a few minutes. So she wrote a biography, a short biography of her father. She was the only daughter of him. And she wrote a short biography, a few 50, 60 pages. And in it, she tells a story that someone asked him, where are you from? I met someone. And Buria? Yeah, Buria David, thank you. So someone met him and asked him, from where is he? He didn't answer from Warsaw. But he told him, it says about Adam Arishon that he was created from earth gathered from all around the world. It says, I am also gathered from all around the world. I don't come only from one place. I am learning, and I became who I am by moving through many, many, many different places. And that's, we'd see in his biography, that is very apparent. And again, it's an answer that reflects his need and the importance that he saw in building his own personality. So he's learning there in the Chederim. In 1922, he also went to the Lomje Yeshiva for a very short period of time, but he came back. It is unclear to us, his daughter doesn't write, then we don't have the information. Why did he return? But many times, I think that you don't need, there is not necessarily some secret to it. Many times, a young child, 15, 14, 13, would go to yeshiva, and back then the yeshiva was very far from home, and after a few weeks or he would discover that it's not for him, and he would return home. So not necessarily there are very big secrets here. So he returns to Warsaw after a short stint in Lomje, and then in 1922, when he's 16, he's being identified by one of the scouters of Rav Natan Tzvi Finkel, the Slabodka Alter. So the Slabodka Alter was one of the students of Rabbi Israel Salant, and his yeshiva Slabodka was one of the very important yeshivot of Musar. And the way that they operated is that they would have the yeshiva and people would come in, young boys, and he would test them, etc. But also he wanted to attract the most skilled and great minds of the next generation. So he had scouters, like sport teams, that would go through the big cities in Europe, the big Jewish cities in Europe, and they would look for the young and the brightest and the promising minds of the next generation. And one of them had identified the 16 years old Yitzchak Hutner as a great mind, which obviously he was, and he is being recruited to the Slabodka Yeshiva. Now, back then, the Slabodka Yeshiva, usually the guys were a little older. But nonetheless, because of his great abilities, Rav Finkel, the Slabodka Alter, agreed to accept him to the yeshiva. Not only that he agreed, he very quickly became one of the closest Talmidim. Now, the Slabodka, the Alter of Slabodka, which we had a shiur about, a year ago or 2 years ago. So he had his own very unique education methods, but he was very heavy-handed would not seem as so, I guess, a compliment. But I mean to say, he was very strong. He was very, very strong. In his yeshiva, he had a system in which if you thought that you are a good student, and there was good students in Talmud, and there were good students in Midot, and somewhere both. So he would have a system in which you would sit at the Bet Midrash according to the level that he assigned to you. So there were students that would sit in the Mizrach because they would be considered Iluim. But in order to sit, you have the Iluim as a sort of the Gemara, the Talmud, you have the Iluim of Midot, and you have the Iluim of both. So it was half formal, the way that he graded the Talmidim. And also when one of the Talmidim did something that was, he thought was unworthy of his status, then he could punish him in ways. So there were punishments. There were sometimes fines, monetary fines, and sometimes he would really punish. So in one famous now again, Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner was his own personality, as I think I mentioned. So Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner would not be so easily shaped into what the Slabodka Alter wanted him to become. And they say that Rav Yitzchak Hutner at certain times while he was in Slabodka, he was either, as many young boys did at the time, he read Haskalah books that he was not supposed to read, and maybe spoke with some of the Bundists in the Jewish communist organization bodies that were also moving around. And the Slabodka Alter thought that he went one step too far. And in order to demonstrate it to the young man, to the young boy, so again, we speak about someone that is 17 years old, on Yom Kippur, he asked one of the older Talmidim to go to Rav Hutner and ask him for the name of his mother. Now, the implication clearly was that the Slabodka Alter feels the need to pray for Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner because of the dangers where he is. Now, Rav Hutner didn't want to tell the Shaliach, right? His name was Yechezkel. So he didn't want to tell him the name of his mother. He wanted to speak with the Slabodka Alter to understand, to clear things out. So he tried to go to the Alter of Slabodka. Now here, there are different versions of the story, but according to most versions, on Yom Kippur, the Alter of Slabodka shouted at him. He shouted, "Do not come into my Arba Amot. Stay away. Tell the guy the name of your mother and I would pray, but do not come near me now." But that's a very strong, of course, thing to say to a young student. I don't think that any one of us as educators would dream to say something like that to one of our students, but especially on Yom Kippur. But the Alter of Slabodka had such, I guess, a confidence in the student, because it's also a question of how much confidence do you have in your students. If you are always worried that they would fall off the derech, then you must be very careful with the amount of push that you give. And you need to increase much more the amount of pull. However, if you have great confidence, I mean to say, you can shout on your children more than you can shout on your students, right? Because that also must have a limit. But however, you have more confidence that they would not abandon you, right? I think, hopefully. And of course, they know you love them. Yes. So that is, I think, an interesting story. And he had a very unique connection with the Alter. So because he adored him, and he was a Talmid of him, and the Saba was taking him close. But on the other hand, Rav Yitzchak Hutner always kept this flame of, I want to be who I am. In 1924, the Slabodka Yeshiva is making a great step, and that is the yeshiva moves to Hebron. So the Slabodka Yeshiva becomes, as I think some of you know, the Hebron Yeshiva, which nowadays, of course, is not in Hebron, but in Givat Mordechai in Yerushalayim. But that is Yeshivat Hebron, because they began in Eretz Yisrael in Hebron. So they make Aliyah, and Rav Hutner joins with the second wave, not in 1924 with the very first few Talmidim, but in 1925 with the second wave of Talmidim. He greatly, we have letters and we have his diary, and he greatly enjoys his time in Hebron and his time in Eretz Yisrael. He also establishes very close connection with Rav Kook. And he becomes almost a student of his. However, this connection would be very complicated as the years would pass by. Just as an example, a few years later, in 1932, Rav Hutner published his first work, a book about Tractate Nazir, called Torah Nazir. And in it, he had an askama from Rav Kook. However, in the second publishment of this book, I think it was in the 50s, after the passing of Rav Kook, but Rav Hutner was still very much alive, and of course he controlled the second printing, he chose to omit the askama of Rav Kook, together with Rav Shapira of Kovno, who was also, it was in the same page. No, they didn't retype, it was an obst. So you can either return the whole page or omit the whole page. So they omitted the whole page with both the askamot of Rav Shapira and Rav Kook. And now, why did it happen? It's a good question. And Rav Hutner, to my knowledge, have never spoke about it, at least not formally. I'm sure that he spoke maybe with close students, but not something that was said formally. But it seems that even when he was learning from Rav Kook and meeting Rav Kook, they were arguing about Rav Kook ties with Tzionut and even more with the Chilonim. And Rav Hutner, even as a young man, thought that Tzionut is a mistake, and the Chilonim are you need to stay away from them, and it's asur to be in close connection with them. And it seems that as he grew older, he made these positions of his became more and more formidable, and so he wanted to distance himself from his former rabbi, I may almost say. And that seems to be the reason for that omission. We also have to remember that political camps in the 30s were very different from the 50s. In the 30s, there was not such a differentiation between Haredi and Tzioni Dati or modern Orthodox, and you can be Haredi but still learn with Rav Kook, and that was possible. But when he was part of Moetzet Gedolei Torah in the 50s and the 60s in the United States of America, you could not be a disciple of Rav Kook anymore. It does not work together. So also the political climate, I think, was not possible anymore to keep these connections. But again, it's not only from political reasons. Obviously, it shows a side. That's what he thought was more correct. So he's learning in Yeshivat Hebron for 3 years, and in Taf Reish Pei Tet, Tarpat, in 1928, he is going out to Europe. Now, again, we don't have a clear understanding of why did he choose to leave Eretz Yisrael and go to a trip in Europe. There is a man that wrote a doctorate, a PhD, on Rav Hutner, and he made throughout all of the archives, etc., etc., etc. And the conclusion he came with is that Rav Hutner was looking for a shidduch. Now, that in itself is it must be correct. I don't know if that's why he went to Chutz La'aretz, but he was already, we speak about 1928, so he's 22. 22 is a good age to look for a shidduch. And I can understand that there were not too many girls in Hebron that were suitable candidates. And the whole Yishuv Yehudi in Eretz Yisrael was very small, yes. In Warsaw, still in Warsaw. Yeah, he did visit them. That's right, he did visit them. That's also happened. So he is going out. The shidduch didn't, if there was a shidduch, it was not executed. And he gets stuck. He has now problems. He has problems with attaining his papers back to Palestine on one hand, and on the other hand, is for some reason, I guess because of all the differences of the First World War and then the interwar years, he lost his citizenship in Poland. I mean, it's beyond me why, but it seems that that was the case. So he was he found himself paperless, stateless, yes, in a very difficult situation, and is going from place to place, issuing every time a visa, a student visa, a tourist visa, and he's traveling in Europe. He is in Warsaw from time to time, that's clear, he's with his parents. Also, he was in Berlin, and almost certainly he participated in some of the lectures in the Humboldt University in Berlin, in philosophy. That's also happened. He was not registered, that we can say for sure, because they have the records, the Germans have the records. So they have the records, and he was not registered, unless he registered by some fake name, but I don't think that he did that. So, but we almost know for sure that he did attend some lectures. So it seems, again, and it's very, I think, appropriate to his personality. He didn't want to become a student in university, but he was interested in broadening his horizons. There he also meets with the young Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, and also with the young Rav Menachem Mendel Schneerson. And he would keep contact with them, of course, throughout the rest of his life, although he would oppose their movements, as Bezrat Hashem would continue to speak. But in personal levels, he was very friendly with both of them. He also learns in the rabbinical seminary in Berlin by Rav Yitzchak, and he has very good connections with Rav Weinberg, Rav Yaakov Yechiel Weinberg, the Sridei Esh, and is affected by their way of learning. And we would see that would play out later. But again, that is not your typical Haredi Gadol growth path, right? Going to hear lectures in the university in Berlin and going to the seminar, the rabbinical seminary in Berlin. All of these were institutions that were borderline. Rabbinical seminary in Berlin was a borderline of orthodoxy, and the University of Berlin, that is obviously beyond the pale. So that's very interesting and not very typical to your classic Slabodka graduate. So again, he's his own man. In 1932, he returns to Israel, and he publishes the Sefer that we spoke about the Tractate Nazir. And then in 1933, he is again going out of Eretz Yisrael. Again, here we can almost say for sure that the reason was Shidduch, because he gets married in Kuvrin in the same year with a woman named Masha Lifshitz from New York. So again, it's very interesting. I don't have any statistical knowledge how many girls from New York who wanted the Frum Shidduch had to travel back to the old country in order to have a good Shidduch. That's meaning in our days there would be girls from New York traveling to Eretz Yisrael in order to get a Shidduch. So it's not so maybe far-fetched to think that sometimes that's what you have to do if you do want to have a yeshiva student. How many yeshiva students could you find in New York at the time? Not too many. So it may very well be that she was traveling there. Now again, how do you, before apps, how do you make contact with someone from New York in order to make, I'm sure that there is a very interesting story behind that, but I don't have access. Some relatives, yeah, it must be. That's a great investment in a blind date, right? To go from New York to Kuvrin. You can't even have a phone call, right? No phones at that. I mean, there are phones, but not in Kuvrin. So you'd have to travel only in order to meet the guy, and then either that it goes or not. But after you invested so much, I guess that you have a very good reason why to make it work. So they get married there in Kuvrin. Kuvrin is in Poland, in East Europe. And then they return, both of them, to Eretz Yisrael again. So it's the third time he makes Aliyah. And this time he sits in Rechavia. He doesn't return to the yeshiva. Slabodka yeshiva. I missed that in 1929, Tarpat, immediately, 2 months after he left for Europe, there was the massacre in Hebron and in Yerushalayim, Meoraot Tarpat. And the yeshiva of Slabodka in Hebron was attacked. It was a horrible attack. Dozens of students were killed. And this was a pogrom, like a Cossack pogrom, but here in Eretz Yisrael, it was of the first times that we understood that the Arabs are not only unhappy about us coming here, but that they are going to be murderous about it. So Merod Tarpat, it's called, the events of 1929. And when he returned to Eretz Yisrael, he was part of the publishing of a memorial book about the students that were killed. The yeshiva relocated. They didn't want to stay in Hebron, so they relocated, and that's how you have this curiosity that Yeshivat Hebron is in Givat Mordechai in Yerushalayim. But he is not happy with the path that the yeshiva is taking, and he thinks that it's not as good as it was. So he goes himself to Rechavia and sits there and opens his own small, but he's still a young man, but he's opening his own Beit Midrash, and he's teaching there, and he's also writing a sefer, a second sefer. This time, he took a manuscript of a Peirush on the Sifra, something that almost you may say esoteric, and it's halachically, so we'll not speak about, but it's esoteric in the halachic sense, and of Rabbeinu Hillel Mivirona wrote a commentary on the Sifra. Now the Sifra itself, it's not one of the most used Midrashei Halacha, and the Peirush of Rabbeinu Hillel was hardly known, but he doesn't want to write about something that everyone wrote about. He wants to write his own thing. He's also encouraged to do that by Rav Meltzer, who pushes him to do so. So he sits, and because he's working with manuscript, then his work is impacted and affected in many ways by the methods he learned in the seminary in Berlin. And in his references, in his notes, he referenced to the works of the rabbis, of the rabbanim, of the seminary. He worked on this book for a few years, as we would see. However, he have never published it under his own name. Many years later, when there was a different work of Rabbeinu Hillel that was published, he gave to the publisher his own work, but asked it not to be published under his own name, so it was published anonymously. Now, again, was it done out of tzniut? Very well, maybe. He didn't want to take credit. Also, it may be that what he thought, as I said, in the 30s, that is possible, that you would write a work, an orthodox rabbinical work, and give reference and notes to the work of Chokrim. He found in his later years that it is unacceptable by the Haredi Orthodox world, and because he didn't want to make too much noise, he censors himself. I mean, he did publish the work as it was, but he preferred not to have his name written on the work. And here I think it's very interesting because, as I said, he was a very authentic man. He believed strongly that one should be himself. But sometimes in order to be yourself, you need, in our culture, we have this thought that in order to be yourself, I need to shout myself out. But that is wrong, because if I shout everything out, then I limit myself to the perceptions of other people. Rav Hutner believed that in order to create authentic existence, then you need not to be looked upon by other people. You are mainstream, you are simple man. No, it's not simple in any ways, but you are not calling attention. And then that creates the room for you in your inner work to do what you think is right and correct. So that's a very interesting, I think, point of view that he had. It's my speculation, but I think it's correct. Okay, we return now. In 1944, he is moving to New York. So as you see, he's traveling a lot. He's moving to New York. Now, why does he move to New York? So the simple reason is because he has a shver and the chamot and the shviger in New York, and his wife wants to be next to her parents. That's a good enough reason in itself. It also very well may be, and here again I'm following the lead of Alon Goshen, that's the guy that wrote the PhD on Rav Hutner, that there was another manuscript of this Rabbeinu Hillel that he was working on in the JTS library. And he wanted to be able to see this manuscript. So again, this is a different, now you cannot imagine a Haredi rabbi from Moetzet Gedolei Torah going to the JTS in order to look in a manuscript. I don't think that's, I mean, you tell me, I guess you know better, but I don't think it's feasible in any sense.
It was different.
Exactly. That's exactly what I want to say.
The JTS was different.
The JTS was different, but also the lines were not so colored as they become in the 60s and the 70s. Yes. So he. That's one. And B, they didn't take so much to the left. And C, the Orthodox didn't went so much to the right. So you had a more mixed and balanced. Now, again, there are advantages and disadvantages to every situation, and I hardly can pass a judgment on things that happen here in Eretz Yisrael. So to pass judgments about a situation that happened in beyond the ocean, that is far, far beyond my abilities. I'm just describing what I think is clear, and people that know the situation better would correct me, but I believe it to be right. That back then, as it says, it was possible, but it became impossible. And that's another reason why he was not able to write his name on the work when it finally, eventually was prepared, was ready. So he sits in New York, and at the beginning, as I said, he's busying himself with writing this book, but he looks around. And the situation of chinuch in New York, Orthodox chinuch, in 1935, 1930, no, 1934, 1934, is not great. Even we can say is much less than great. It's weak. It's weak. And he is looking around and he wants to open yeshiva as yeshiva should be, as Slabodka is. And there was already yeshiva there, meaning again, now here, the word yeshiva is a little misleading because here in Eretz Yisrael, when you speak, and also in Europe, usually yeshiva meant high school and up. However, as I think you all know, in the United States, they use the word yeshiva many times for elementary school. And the high school is called Metivta. And so they have a whole different system of names. It doesn't really matter, but just in order for us to understand what we are speaking about. So there was a yeshiva, which was, I think we'd call it today middle school, the ages there, which was called Yeshivat Chaim Berlin. And that was already established, but it was not, again, I hope that I'm not misspeaking, Chas v'Chaila. It was not strong. Total, yeah. So, but again, but not in the 30s, I guess. In the 40s, after Rav Hutner came. Yeah. So in the 30s, before Rav Hutner came in, it was not strong. When he came in, they invited him to join. Very quickly he became the Rosh Yeshiva because he was Rav Yitzchak Hutner, because otherwise you would not give a shiur about him, right? So he was a great man. He was a great man both in his Torah and in his chinuch. And I want to read with you something very interesting. Source bet. This is something that he wrote in his diary in 1934 as he becoming this Rosh Yeshiva. And he's in America. So it's very interesting. Ha'olam olech u'mishtakea b'ma'asiyut. So the world is becoming more and more practical. That's very American. This sentence in itself is very American, right? Because again, I apologize and you'd correct me, but of course we speak about a nation of 300 million people, but we have to be very careful. However, I think that it would not be far-fetched to say that practical philosophy, right, came from the United States. Practical religion, in many senses, came from the United States. So practicality, that's a very important factor in the culture of the United States. And he's sitting there and says everything is so practical. Because again, this is someone that learned philosophy in Berlin. So philosophy in Berlin, even philosophy, secular philosophy. Philosophy in Berlin and philosophy in New York are very different methods, are very different studies. So מחשבות, הרגשות, שירה, חקירה, עיונים, פלפולים נהלכות דעות, נאומים וחובות הלבבות. כל אלו חדלו מלהיות נקודת השריפה של מחשבת העולם. So he says, poetry, thoughts, emotions, deep studies, פלפולים, sermons, all of these cease to be the point of inflection in the thought of the world. Instead, there are others that are now the most important. ואלו הם עובדות, ממשיות, מציאות, empirical. Now, empiricist. You want to convince me in something? Give me facts. Don't tell me stories. Give me facts. You want me to be religious? Show me how to be religious would make me better. Then I'm coming with you. That's, again, I apologize for saying, but that's at least how he saw the American way. Give me facts on the ground. Explain to me why is it better, but not in lofty ideas about the spirit of the world. I'm not interested in that. Tachles. What is the outcome? Not necessarily money. It can be also happiness. But show me why is it good. מה עלינו אנשי התורה והיראה לעשות במצב העניינים הזה? So what can we as men of Torah and fear of God can do in this type of situation? להשתמש בנשק של השונא, so we must weaponize this very method. ואם כן, עלינו לענות בעובדות, we should also state facts. We should also have mamash. real. But what do we have? אבל הלא אין ברשותנו כי אם לכתוב ספרים, להדפיס מאמרים, להרצות הרצאות, וכל אלו עניינים עסקי רוח. He says the problem is, as a rabbi, what can I do? I can speak, I can lecture, I can write books. But this is all immediately being washed aside as Lufthangeschäft. Right? עסקי רוח. This is things, words. That's how they relate. If you begin to speak about spirituality, they say, oh, but what is the outcome? What is the tachlis? So what can we do? המפלט היחידי אל הממש הוא האישיות. That's amazing. He says, there is only one real thing that we can sell. Not words, not ideas. All of these are immediately pushed aside. Personality. The personality shines through. It shines through the face. It shines through the eyes. So if you have a student, you can lecture him from today to tomorrow. And maybe in other settings, you know, in Russia, in Germany, lectures would work, ideas work. But here, in the kingdom of practicality, you need to show him something that is real, that is tangible, that you can touch. Human beings are something that you can touch. If you can show him a real human being, a mensch, that would be the force that would pull him to Torah and Ira. That's an amazing, I think that's an amazing understanding. Again, very keen observation, very keen observation. He says, Adam, man, hu uvda, is for real. Again, I hope any one of us have met in his life people of greatness, of Torah. And when you meet someone like this is not stories. Even what we are doing here, we are trying to feel through the words these persons. But when you meet them in person, and you see something of the divine in this small word, then that is something that you see that exists. You don't need to be convinced afterwards, because you saw it. You saw what Torah can do. אישיות אחת החיה את חייה הגדולים, one personality that lives its great life, מוארים באור התורה, and it's enlightened in the light of Torah, משקלה גדול מכמה וכמה רעיונות ונאומים ויצירות שבו. It's an amazing sentence. He says, you should know that the effect of one personality that lives enlightened with Torah, and that the Torah shines forth from it, that is more than what dozens of books can achieve. And that was the type of chinuch that he believed in. So he, as we see, he did write books, but much later in his life. And he invested his whole being into the education of these children in Yeshivat Chaim Berlin. One of the students, by the way, was Rav Lichtenstein. So that's also an interesting connection. Okay. Our time is beginning to be short. Now he develops in the yeshiva. He develops the yeshiva. He develops later. He opens a continuation of higher education. He opens the first kollel. I believe the first kollel in Brooklyn, or maybe the first even in the United States. It's 1957. How many kollelim were there in maybe Lakewood? I don't know. But
No, Lakewood, there was one in Borough.
did not exist yet in 1957. So it may be the very first. I don't want to say the first because, always there can be, again, it's a big country. But it was almost certainly one of the very first. Of Yafen. And do you remember when it was founded? That was in the 40s already. Okay, so that was before. So that it was the second or the third. But in Brooklyn, that's not in the east side. But in Brooklyn, I'm sure that was the first. Okay. In 1967, he begins to publish what is much known for, if you are not a Talmid of his, in Yeshivat Rabbeinu Chaim Berlin, and that is Pachad Yitzchak series. This is a very interesting series of books on the festivals, on the Chagim. So you have a book for every festival, and they are lectures that he gave. However, they are not only sermons. They are much longer than a sermon, most of them. And it's not a sermon because it's not only giving you some thought. He is trying to really sharpen your understanding of Yahadut through the festivals. So now it's written in Hebrew. It's not the easiest Hebrew, and it's very Talmudic. He's a Lithuanian rabbi. He's not a philosopher. So in the end, he gives you the philosophy, but dressed in a kashya on a Chazal, and then I have a kashya on some halacha, and then I have a teirutz from the Maharal, and then I tie them all together. So it's beautiful, but it's not something that you read on the bus. You need to see, it's not a sermon for shul. If I would give such a sermon here, that would be the end. So you need to open the book, you need to sit for 45 minutes at least for the short ones, and to invest the time. And I try to do here some injustice with one of these ma'amarim for Shavuot. It's beautiful, but again, it requires investment. I don't think it was translated to English, which is surprising. Maybe yes, no, it's not to be translated. I don't know. You have an English one? Of Purim. So okay, so one of them at least was translated. Maybe all of them. I don't know. That's something to be checked. However, I would give it Baal Peh, an idea of his for Shavuot, and he says, man was born alone, right? Adam Arishon was born, only him. Now, what does it mean? Why didn't God create the whole colony of people right in the beginning? Why created man alone? He says that is because man has a lonely feature. Now, Rav Soloveitchik at the same time is writing The Lonely Man of Faith, but so the ideas are out there. Also, that is part of what is called existentialism, thank you, which is a strand of philosophy that's the question of the loneliness of man is one of its main strands. So it's again, didn't made up this idea, but you see how he's trying to take it in. So he says man was created alone. So there is a certain type of loneliness. Loneliness would also mean that each one of us has an authentic existence which only belongs to him. You cannot be me. The ideas that I have, the personality that I have, my life journey is mine. That's, of course, it's part of his philosophy of education. Each student must have his own journey. He said many times, they quote in his name that he said that a school, a yeshiva, is not a salami factory. You cannot, instead of the cookie cutter example, he gave the salmi example. So you cannot just cut them to slices. Each one must be molded according to who he was. Now, of course, you want the direction, but you need to let them develop their own skills. And then he says, but the problem is, so our problem is that we are, and so we want, because we were created like that, it is something that always want to get out, that we want to express our individuality, our specialness. And it looks for ways to express itself. So some people would dress very strangely. Why? Because they want to be unique. And then you have a whole classroom of students, all of them are unique, right? Because so people are looking for their uniqueness. And he says, that's fine, that's good. Now again, your typical Orthodox thinker would say, no, that's a Yetzer Hara, that's a Ga'ava, you should delete it. Orthodox means being firm, being straight, being mainstream. He says, no, that's a good thing. It's part of how man was created, how human beings were created. And if people feel that you relate to them not as who they are, but in some generic sense, that is, people feel that that's humiliating. I will tell a story of my own, not of his, but every end of year, I'm trying to give, I'm speaking with each student and speak with him about his own thing, how the year was for him, and he tells me, and I tell him how I see it. And obviously, I'm trying usually to encourage them. And a few years ago, I spoke with one of the students, and I thought it was, I sit before this sichot and I look at the record and I'm thinking what I'm going to say. So I'm trying really to give everyone his own personal eitzah. However, I made a sicha with one of these guys. And the same evening, I get a phone call from his mother. And she says to me, how can you be? You taught my son the whole year, and he looks at you, and now you tell him such generic terms. That's the what she used. She told me you use generic terms. Now, I was so shocked, and I said, I felt that I did my best, but thank you for what you're saying, and I try to think about it and improve and correct what you can say. So I did my best to diffuse the situation. But I'm saying, so you can see, he was, I guess, he finished the talk with me. He felt that I treated him in a generic way, and he transferred it to his mother, and still the humiliation and the anger was so strong that it came back to bite me. Okay. So that's what he says here. All of that is fine. He says, but how can you really be special? Because clothes, again, are not special. You can run, the fastest runner in the world. That's also not special, because it's not special to human beings. There are cheetahs that would run faster than you are, even if you'd be the fastest human beings in the world. So what is special about human beings? He says, their dea, their mind. What is special about human beings is their mind. And because each one of us has his own mind, כשם שפרצופיהם שונים זה מזה, כך דעותיהם שונות. The same that our faces are different from one another, each one of us has his own experiences, his own way to look at things. It says, this is where your uniqueness can and should and must come to fruition. And he says, now, what is, of course, the best method, the best way to engage your mind in? Obviously, with the wisdom of the Torah, with the wisdom of God. So he says, when you learn Torah, that's how you express your unique personality. You can see it, and you learn Parshat Shavuot. You don't need to write or to read or to learn about Nazir. You read Parshat Shavuot, and you read about Moshe Rabbeinu, and you read about Aaron, and you read about the people in the desert. And you have your own way to look at that. That this way to look at things, that is only yours. There is no one else in the world that would be able to look at these psukim as you look at them, because of your own personal life experience. And he says, so the way to express your uniqueness, which is a mitzvah, which is part of who you are, is by the learning of Torah. And he says that is why Shavuot is such an important chag. So we return now to Shavuot. He said, because in Shavuot, it's not only that the Torah was given. In Shavuot, we were given a way to express our most core identity of individual human beings, of authentic. We can find our authenticity in Torah. So you can see, some of you that are more trained in Western philosophy may maybe identify Heidegger here a little, and other that he may have heard in the Berlin University. But he takes that, and he's a Lithuanian Rosh Yeshiva. Now, no Heidegger in his books. You can find the name, of course, mentioned anyway. But the ideas are being transformed and are being translated and are being converted in the good sense of the word into the ideas of Torah. He says that's why en Beit HaMidrash belo chidush. You cannot sit and learn without something new coming out of what you have learned. Why? Because just the very fact that you as an individual human being meet this text, although this text was already read by millions of Jews before you, but no one was just as you are. And so by the meeting with Torah, we express our own and we create our own unique identity. That's an idea of his for Shavuot. We have finished, so we don't have the time to speak about how in 1970, the plane he was on, flying from Eretz Yisrael to basically to New York, was kidnapped by terrorists, hijacked. Yeah, for a few weeks he was in Jordan, and in the end, Hussein Melech Yarden, who this Black September that some of you may have heard, he was able to release him. In 1979, he made Aliyah again to Yerushalayim. He opened a yeshiva in Har Nof. However, unfortunately, a year later, he died because of a disease and was niftar. So in 1980, he was niftar. That's the life story of Rav Yitzchak Hutner, a very important and prominent figure in the development of the yeshiva system in America. And we didn't speak about his institutional importance, but I think that we spoke about his educational importance. And I believe that he himself, I would have asked him, I have very limited time. Would you prefer me to speak about your educational methods or about your role in Moetzet Gdolei HaTorah? I believe that he would also have said that he would prefer that we would speak about his educational faith. So that's what we did today. And I highly encourage you, especially if they are in English, Mamarim of Pachad Yitzchak to Shavuot, try to find something and make some time and sit and learn, and I'm sure that you would enjoy it greatly. Thank you, and have a Chag Sameach.